Garrett Hale thrived on dominance, authority, and certainty. Nothing in his realm ever took him by surprise. Until two identical 6-year-old girls stood before him, their wide blue eyes fixated on his. "Excuse me, sir, but it seems we've lost our way," one of them remarked. The other gave a slight nod. "We had been searching for you." Garrett stood still, his thoughts swirling in a tempest. In search of him. Before he could fully grasp the unfolding events, a sharp exhale escaped him. "Very well," he murmured. "Let's work through this together." Garrett Hale hurried along the sidewalk, his gaze fixed forward as he glanced at his watch. He arrived late for a meeting, an occurrence that was quite rare for him. His existence was founded on unwavering discipline and strict control, and tardiness was a flaw he could not abide, particularly in his own conduct. The driver stood patiently by the curb, the polished black car shining brilliantly in the warm glow of the late afternoon sun. As he extended his hand toward the door handle, a faint voice called out, halting him in his tracks. "Excuse me, sir." Garrett pivoted abruptly, a scowl forming on his face. Just a short distance away stood two young girls, probably no more than 6 years old. Identical dark curls framed their small faces, while their striking blue eyes, unmistakably the same shade as his own, looked up at him, reflecting a blend of uncertainty and determination. His initial reaction was to look around, scanning for a worried parent or guardian, yet the sidewalk appeared largely deserted. The young women found themselves in solitude. "Do you feel disoriented?" he inquired, maintaining a steady tone. One of them paused, her teeth grazing her lip as she shook her head in uncertainty. The other, exuding a hint of confidence, stepped forward. "Your presence was sought after." Garrett tensed, his hold on the car door becoming more rigid. That response took him by surprise. "You were searching for me," he reiterated, his tone steady. The two girls nodded in unison. Garrett experienced an unsettling sensation take root in his chest. Kids weren't merely on the hunt for corporate leaders. There was an unsettling feeling about this situation. "What is the location of your parents?" he inquired. The more daring twin paused for just a moment before responding. "In the comfort of my own space." Garrett squinted, his gaze sharp and focused. "Are they aware of your presence?" This time, the response was not as prompt. The more reserved twin moved subtly, her fingers gripping the strap of her petite backpack with a hint of tension. The subtle hint of remorse on her face revealed all he required to understand. "No," she confessed gently. Garrett let out a slow breath, shifting his gaze between the two of them. Their lack of fear only deepened the oddity of the moment. What brought them here, if they weren't lost and their parents were unaware of their presence? "What was it that prompted you to seek me out?" he inquired, his arms crossed. The young women shared a fleeting look. The individual who had been more vocal retrieved an item from her backpack and extended it towards him. The photograph was aged and weathered. Garrett accepted it, his breath hitching in his throat as his eyes landed on the image. It was indeed him. A young man, clad in a relaxed button-down shirt, stands next to a woman with gentle brown eyes and dark, curly hair. He recognized this image. He was familiar with her. Mallory Carter. A name that had slipped from his mind over the years. His gaze darted back to the twins, a chill creeping down his spine. "She is our mother," the girls whispered softly. Garrett felt his heart racing in his ears. He glanced at the photograph once more, then shifted his gaze to the two little girls with matching blue eyes. After years of certainty, Garrett Hale found himself at a loss for words. Garrett gazed intently at the photograph he held, his grip firming around its frayed edges. The image bore a slight fade, yet the identities of the two figures within were unmistakable, him and Mallory. Years had passed since he last laid eyes on her, and she had faded from his thoughts long ago. Yet here he stood, on a bustling sidewalk, faced with two little girls who insisted she was their mother. His thoughts surged with a flurry of options, seeking a rationale that resonated. Perhaps it was an error. Perhaps they mistook someone else for the intended target. Perhaps this was an intricate misinterpretation. Yet, as he gazed at them once more, those expansive blue eyes fixed on him with a serene expectation, he understood instinctively that it was far from a mistake. "Where is your mother now?" he inquired, his tone measured, though lacking the usual steadiness. "At home," the more daring twin declared. "She remains unaware of our presence." Garrett sensed a transformation within himself. "You fled." The reserved girl paused briefly before giving a nod. "We sought to discover your whereabouts." He clutched the photo more firmly, absorbing their words. "Mallory did not send them. They arrived independently, suggesting that she either hadn't mentioned him or hadn't anticipated their paths would cross. Regardless of the circumstances, they had located him, and now 2 6-year-old girls stood before him, anticipating something he wasn't certain he could provide. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, running a hand through his dark curls. He found himself unaccustomed to interacting with children, especially not two who had pursued him in such a manner. "Your mother is likely feeling quite anxious." The first twin, Lily, as he would come to know, moved ever so slightly. "We believed she would remain oblivious." Garrett exhaled deeply, pressing his fingers against the bridge of his nose. He had constructed his existence around order, mastery, and deliberate choices. Everything in his realm was meticulously orchestrated. However, this? 2 small girls appearing unexpectedly, their eyes reflecting his own. This was an unforeseen circumstance for him. "How did you manage to track me down?" he finally inquired. Sophie, the more reserved twin, retrieved an item from her backpack, a piece of paper meticulously folded multiple times. She passed it to him, and as he opened it, he instantly identified what it was. A physical document containing the address of his company. Garrett scowled. "Where did you obtain this?" Lily confessed, hidden away in a box in her mother's closet. She possessed a collection of letters and documents. "We came across your name and decided to search for it." Garrett took a deep breath, striving to manage the mounting irritation within him. They sifted through Mallory's belongings, uncovered his name, and somehow navigated their way here without her awareness. That in itself was a bold move. Yet, what burdened him even more was the realization that Mallory had evidently preserved remnants of him in her existence, despite never having made an effort to connect. He finally said, "You ought to have informed her of your destination." Sophie glanced at him, her brow furrowed slightly, and said, "We didn't think you'd be upset. We were simply curious about your identity." Her words pierced through him more profoundly than he had anticipated. Garrett had dedicated years to steering clear of connections, evading anything that might anchor him. He had never contemplated the possibilities that could have unfolded after he and Mallory parted ways. He had never considered that 2 little girls could be growing up completely unaware of his existence. And now they had arrived. He spoke softly, his voice barely above a whisper, "You know now. What unfolds next?" The young women exchanged glances before turning their attention back to him. "Is it possible for us to speak with Mom first?" Lily inquired. Garrett let out a breath. That was the sole element that resonated with clarity. He found it impossible to remain on the sidewalk with 2 bewildered children, feigning any sense of direction for what to do next. "Hop in," he urged, gesturing to his polished black car. "I'm bringing you back home." As they climbed in, Garrett settled into the driver's seat, his hands firmly clutching the steering wheel. He arrived today anticipating a standard business meeting. Instead, he found himself behind the wheel, transporting 2 young girls, his daughters, to meet a woman he hadn't laid eyes on in nearly 7 years. For the first time in his life, he stood before that door, completely unaware of what awaited him beyond it. The journey to the girls' home was subdued, yet it lacked the familiar, cozy stillness that Garrett typically appreciated. The stillness hung thick in the air, burdened with unspoken inquiries he hesitated to voice and responses he feared might shatter his resolve. Lily and Sophie nestled in the back seat, their petite forms almost lost in the plush leather of his car. He was taken aback by their lack of fear. If anything, they appeared hopeful. It was as though they had been aware from the very beginning that he would lead them back to their place of belonging. Garrett's fingers curled around the steering wheel with a sense of determination as he navigated onto a well-known street. He hadn't visited in years, yet everything appeared unchanged. The row of townhouses, the tree-lined sidewalk, the small neighborhood park at the end of the block, it all exuded an aura of timelessness. He arrived at a humble yet tidy home and parked in the driveway. As soon as he turned off the engine, the front door flew open. Mallory stood on the porch, her dark brown hair gathered in a haphazard bun, her complexion drained of color, reflecting her anxiety. The moment she caught sight of the twins in the back seat, her face transformed from fear to relief, and then to a more intense emotion, anger. Before Garrett could even exit the car, she was already advancing toward them, her steps brisk and imbued with intent. Lily. Sophie. Her voice was filled with urgency, tinged with longing. What was on your mind? The moment Garrett unlocked the doors, both girls burst out of the car with excitement. They hurried to their mother, their heads bowed in remorse as she enveloped them in a warm embrace. Apologies, Mom, Sophie whispered softly against her shoulder. Lily added gently, we simply wanted to see him. Mallory tightened her hold before releasing slightly, her hands clasping their arms with a gentle yet steady grip. You scared me half to death, she said, her voice trembling. It's not acceptable to leave without a word. Garrett lingered next to his car, observing the drama as it unfolded before him. He had steeled himself for anger, for accusations, but he hadn't anticipated the unfiltered emotion in Mallory's eyes as she gazed at her daughters. At last, she stood tall, her eyes locking onto him with intensity. What brings you here? She inquired, her voice tinged with doubt. Garrett locked eyes with her, maintaining a steady tone. They arrived in search of me. I brought them back to my place. Mallory let out a sharp breath, massaging her temple. Naturally, they did. She glanced over her shoulder at the girls. Step inside. At this moment, Lily and Sophie exchanged uncertain looks, stealing a glance at Garrett before finally nodding in agreement. They approached the house, their gazes lowered, while the two adults remained in a charged silence. As the front door clicked shut, Mallory folded her arms tightly across her chest. Her voice was low and controlled as she spoke. Now you are informed. Garrett inclined his head with deliberation. Indeed. At this moment, clarity has been achieved. She released a sharp laugh, her head shaking in disbelief. It certainly took a while. His jaw tightened. You never shared that with me, Mallory. Her expression grew steely. Could it have changed anything? Garrett found himself at a loss for words. And the fact that he didn't frustrate him more than anything. Mallory let out a weary sigh, her hand brushing over her face in a moment of exasperation. I really prefer not to handle this in public. Step inside. He paused briefly, contemplating before ascending the steps behind her. The interior of the house exuded warmth and a sense of life. It may not have been large, but it was brimming with vitality, children's drawings adorning the fridge, a basket of laundry resting by the couch, and a handful of toys strewn about near the stairs. The aroma wafted through the air, a blend of cinnamon and an indistinct floral note, evoking a sense of familiarity that caused a subtle tightening in his chest. Mallory waved her hand in the direction of the kitchen. Take a seat. Garrett slid into a chair at the quaint wooden table, observing her as she filled her cup with coffee before glancing in his direction. Are you interested in having one? She inquired. Negative. She nonchalantly shrugged, savoring a sip before settling down across from him. Silence enveloped them, stretching on as neither dared to break it. At last, Mallory placed her cup on the table and met his gaze directly. "I never intended for you to discover this." Garrett released a slow breath. "What is the reason?" She released a dry, mirthless laugh. "Are you seriously inquiring about that?" "Indeed, Mallory, I am," he replied, his tone unwavering yet resolute. "You must have realized I would have been curious to find out." She gazed at him intently for what felt like an eternity before she finally responded. "Upon discovering my pregnancy, I considered sharing the news with you," she confessed. "I truly did. Yet you had already departed, Garrett. You were ascending in your journey, carving out your identity. And I was aware of the consequences that would follow if I revealed it to you." His brow knitted in concentration. "Could you clarify what you mean?" She reclined in her chair, crossing her arms. She stated it plainly, "You would have felt a sense of obligation. Not out of desire, but because it was the morally correct choice. I had no desire for that. I never intended for you to be part of their life simply out of obligation. Your presence was desired in their life because you genuinely wished to be a part of it." Garrett tightened his jaw. "That choice wasn't yours to determine." "Perhaps not," Mallory conceded. "Yet, I accomplished it regardless." Once more, silence enveloped them, but this time it felt more oppressive. Garrett cast his eyes toward the living room, where the soft murmur of the girls' conversation drifted down from upstairs. His daughters. He finally expressed his desire to be part of their lives. Mallory observed him intently. "What is the reason for this moment?" He expressed that he ought to have been present from the start. "And since they sought me out. That must signify something important." She gazed at her coffee cup, her finger gliding along the rim. As she began to speak once more, her tone had taken on a gentler quality. She confessed that they had always been curious about you. I always spoke the truth to them. I simply never provided them with answers. It seems that only heightened their curiosity." Garrett gave a slow, deliberate nod. Mallory inhaled deeply. "Very well," she replied. "If you genuinely wish to be a part of their lives, then show it." His eyes narrowed with intensity. "In what way?" She offered him a faint, weary smile. "Be present." It appeared to be the most straightforward challenge, yet it somehow seemed like the most difficult one. Garrett dedicated years to attending meetings, engaging in business deals, and negotiating contracts valued in the millions. However, this felt unique. This time, he was not merely demonstrating his worth to a panel of executives. He was demonstrating his worth to them. The journey back to his penthouse was serene, yet Garrett's thoughts were anything but tranquil. He held the steering wheel firmly, his jaw set tight as he went over every word Mallory had spoken. She had withheld them from him. His daughters. The frustration he experienced in her kitchen remained, bubbling just beneath the surface. Yet, underneath it all, there lay something more. A profound essence. Remorse. Despite his desire to be angry with Mallory, he found it impossible to overlook the reality of the situation. She was correct about one aspect. In those days, he would have been at a loss for what to do. He had been overly fixated on his profession, excessively consumed by the need to validate his worth in the business realm. Had she confided in him, would he have chosen wisely? He was unaware. That uncertainty felt far more daunting than the anger itself. As he finally navigated into the dimly lit underground parking garage of his building, he exhaled slowly, attempting to untangle the thoughts swirling in his mind. He exited the car and made his way directly to the elevator, hardly noticing the doorman's greeting. His penthouse remained exactly as he had remembered it, immaculate, quiet, and unspoiled. The expansive windows showcased the city skyline, with the shimmering lights of the skyscrapers extending infinitely beyond the transparent barrier. The view was the stuff of dreams. But at this moment, it simply felt hollow. He strolled over to the bar, pouring himself a glass of whiskey. With a deliberate sip, he gazed out at the city, lost in thought. His thoughts wandered back to the events of that evening. The expressions on Lily and Sophie's faces when they inquired about his identity were unforgettable. The manner in which they held on to Mallory upon sensing her distress. They were not merely two ordinary children. They belonged to him. His daughters. A peculiar, uncharted feeling coursed through him at the thought. It stood apart from commerce, from transactions, from anything he had ever navigated previously. It was not an obstacle he could navigate with mere tactics. He had dedicated years to making choices that influenced entire sectors, yet he had never faced a decision as crucial as this one. Is it possible for him to accomplish this? Would they truly desire that from him? The sudden buzz of his phone yanked him from his reverie. He cast his eyes upon the screen. Mallory. He paused briefly before responding. Indeed. A silence lingered on the other end before she finally began to speak. The girls can't seem to stop discussing you. Garrett let out a breath, his fingers weaving through his tousled curls. Is that a positive development? Mallory released a gentle laugh, yet an underlying weariness lingered within it. I'm still uncertain at this point. The silence lingered in the air between them. At last, she let out a deep breath. Observe. Today was quite overwhelming. For everyone. However, if you truly intend to be a part of their lives, I must be assured that you will genuinely be present. Not merely today. Not solely during moments of ease. Garrett rested against the counter, his gaze fixed on the deep hue of the liquid swirling in his glass. I truly meant what I said, he responded. I desire to be present. Another silence fell, followed by a softer voice. Then demonstrate it. Garrett's brow furrowed ever so slightly. In what way? Mallory stated plainly, return tomorrow. Dedicate moments to their company. Familiarize yourself with them. He took a deep breath, then gave a subtle nod, though she was unaware of it. Understood. All right, she responded. Looking forward to seeing you tomorrow. She terminated the conversation before he had the chance to utter another word. Garrett placed his phone aside and savored another deliberate sip of whiskey. For the first time in his life, he was venturing into an unknown realm beyond his grasp. There exists a sense of ambiguity. A bit chaotic. Yet, oddly enough, it failed to instill the fear it ought to have. After so many years, his mind was finally free from the constant chatter of deals, profits, and power. He found himself lost in thoughts of them. Garrett showed up at Mallory's house the following afternoon, ahead of his original schedule. He lingered in his car for a few moments, gazing at the front door, attempting to dismiss the strange heaviness resting on his chest. He had entered boardrooms packed with cutthroat executives, struck billion-dollar deals with individuals who would betray their own kin for gain, and yet, nothing had ever left him feeling as ill-equipped as this. With a steadying inhale, he exited the vehicle and approached the porch. Just as he raised his hand to knock, the door unexpectedly swung open. Lily remained rooted in place, her eyes wide as she gazed up at him, a look of astonishment dancing across her features. Welcome to this moment. Garrett raised an eyebrow. It seems like my arrival caught you off guard. She gave a slight shrug. Mom mentioned you would be here, but Sophie suggested you could have second thoughts. There was something about that resonated deeply. So, what are your thoughts? Lily tilted her head, deep in thought. I figured that if you truly wanted to be here, you would have arrived early. Garrett wore a subtle smirk. It seems I've successfully navigated the challenge. Just as she was about to speak again, Sophie emerged from behind her. She gazed at him for a moment, then tilted her head slightly. Mom, he's really here. Mallory's voice floated in from the kitchen. Allow him entry before you continue with the announcements, Sophie. The twins moved aside, allowing Garrett to enter, enveloped by the comforting warmth of the house. Aromatic notes of sweetness wafted through the atmosphere, reminiscent of cinnamon and vanilla. The living room exuded a sense of warmth and comfort, its neatness complemented by personal touches that spoke of life within its walls, picture frames adorning the shelves, a cozy blanket casually thrown over the couch, and a handful of toys strewn about near the staircase. It was a stark contrast to the chilly, sparse penthouse he came back to each evening. Mallory stepped out of the kitchen, drying her hands on a dish towel. She cast a quick glance at the clock, then offered him a nod of approval. "You've arrived ahead of schedule." Garrett gave a nonchalant shrug. "Lily mentioned that this was the sole method to demonstrate my desire to be present." Mallory offered a subtle smile, gently shaking her head. "They possess a resilience that belies their appearance." Lily beamed with delight. "It comes from our mother." Mallory let out an exasperated sigh. "All right, let's stop teaming up against him. Please, both of you, grab your coats. We are heading out." Garrett lifted an eyebrow in curiosity. "We exist." Mallory gave a subtle nod. "I thought that if you're genuinely interested in getting to know them, then awkwardly sitting in my living room might not be the ideal approach." He found it hard to dispute that. Moments later, they found themselves in his car, making their way to the park. The girls filled the back seat with their lively chatter, occasionally directing their words to him, but mostly engaging with one another, creating a surprisingly cozy atmosphere amidst the silence. "So, you have wealth, correct?" Sophie inquired abruptly. Garrett cast a fleeting look at her via the rearview mirror. "Perhaps something along those lines." Lily inclined her body ever so slightly. "What level of wealth are we talking about?" Mallory let out a deep breath. "Young women." "Excuse me?" Lily remarked with a touch of naivety. "That's a reasonable inquiry." Garrett wore a sly grin. "Abundantly sufficient." Sophie narrowed her eyes at him. "Imagine being wealthy enough to own a pet tiger." Garrett let out a soft laugh. "What purpose would a tiger serve for me?" Lily gave a nonchalant shrug. "As the leader of the organization. CEOs can exhibit some peculiar behaviors at times." Mallory let out a frustrated sigh. "Please refrain from assuming that every CEO is irrational." Sophie folded her arms across her chest. "So, what's the use of wealth if it doesn't come with something exciting?" Garrett paused to reflect. "I possess an aircraft." The twins shared astonished looks. "Do you possess an aircraft?" Lily inquired. Garrett gave a slight nod. "And a chopper." Sophie's jaw fell slack. "Is it possible for us to take a ride in it?" Mallory shifted in her seat. "Definitely not." Garrett wore a sly grin. "Perhaps in the future." The twins exchanged eager whispers while Mallory cast him a sharp warning glare. He merely shrugged, finding it amusing how swiftly they had embraced the concept. In the park, the girls dashed forward, their joyous laughter echoing through the cool autumn breeze. Garrett stood next to Mallory, observing as they ascended onto the swings. After a pause, she remarked, "They have a fondness for you." Garrett cast a fleeting look in her direction. "Indeed." Mallory gave a slight nod. "However, they are not quick to place their trust in others. If you choose to be part of their lives, ensure that your commitments are ones you can honor." Garrett's jaw clenched. "I uphold my commitments." Mallory scrutinized him, as though weighing the possibility of trusting that statement. Following a lengthy silence, she gave a nod. "Excellent." They remained quiet, observing as Sophie soared off the swing with a victorious laugh, soon followed by Lily. After a long time, Garrett sensed a change stirring within him. For the first time, he felt no fear of it. The subsequent days unfolded in a manner that was entirely foreign to Garrett. His typical routine, orderly, methodical, and expected, had been upended by two tiny forces of nature known as Lily and Sophie. Rather than engaging in a series of consecutive meetings and business discussions, he now faced a barrage of quick questions covering topics ranging from his preferred cuisine to whether he had ever battled a shark. He had anticipated a sense of distance, a hesitance in their interactions, yet that was not the nature of their engagement. Initially, they approached him with caution, observing him as if he were an intriguing enigma. However, once they concluded that he was there to stay, they quickly integrated him into their lives. It was a lot to take in. And oddly enough, he found it acceptable. On the fourth day, Mallory reached out to him. After completing his review of the contract, he leaned back in his office chair, taking a moment to reflect. "They keep asking when you'll be back," she remarked, cutting him off before he could say hello. Garrett flashed a sly grin, stealing a glance at the clock. "Are you already feeling my absence?" Mallory let out a derisive snort. "Not I. Them." He paused for just a moment before responding. "I will arrive in 1 hour." As he approached the house, the front door swung open, anticipating his arrival before he even had the chance to knock. Lily and Sophie burst forth, their expressions glowing as they seized his hands. Sophie declared that Mom had said we could go get ice cream. "Is it possible for us to do that?" Lily inquired, gazing up at him with large, expectant eyes. Garrett lifted an eyebrow in curiosity. "Are you aware that dinner time is approaching?" Lily nodded with a grave expression. "That's why we need to act quickly before Mom has a change of heart." Mallory stood in the doorway, her arms crossed defiantly. "I never consented to that before dinner." Lily and Sophie directed matching, imploring looks at their mother, their eyes large and filled with theatrical purity. Mallory let out a heavy sigh. "All right. However, in modest amounts." The girls erupted in cheers as Garrett guided them toward the car. The journey was alive with lively conversation, as Lily and Sophie passionately argued about which flavors reigned supreme. Lily proclaimed that chocolate is undoubtedly the finest. Sophie contended that it's quite elementary. Mint chocolate chip reigned supreme. Garrett wore a sly grin. "Honestly, I tend to prefer the classic options." Both girls inhaled sharply, their expressions twisting into a dramatic display of shock. Mallory, seated in the passenger seat, shook her head in disbelief. "Do you truly wish to be included in their lives?" Garrett chuckled, a sound that still felt oddly effortless. "I suppose it's time to refine my preferences." At the ice cream shop, the girls eagerly dove into selecting their flavors. While they dined, Sophie abruptly raised her gaze to him, her demeanor noticeably more solemn than typical. "Will you be joining us for our birthday celebration?" The inquiry took him by surprise. "What date do you celebrate your birthday?" "Next month," Lily remarked, savoring the taste on her spoon. Garrett stole a look at Mallory, who was observing him intently. He cast a glance over his shoulder at the twins. "Absolutely, I will be present." Sophie regarded him intently for a prolonged moment before giving a nod. "Understood." Garrett felt an inexplicable weight to that single word, as if it carried a significance beyond mere acknowledgement. It seemed like an examination. He was determined not to fail. A week went by, and Garrett discovered himself settling into a new cadence, one that felt entirely unfamiliar yet strangely instinctive at the same moment. His existence had consistently been organized, regulated, with each second meticulously noted. Yet now, his routine was punctuated by enthusiastic phone calls from Lily and Sophie, beckoning him to visit, accompanied by the anticipation that he would indeed make an appearance. And he certainly did. Initially, he believed the twins would regard him as an outsider, a stranger in their midst. However, they welcomed him with open arms, seamlessly integrating him into their vibrant lives. They expressed thoughts on every detail, from the type of shoes he ought to don, to the films he must see, and even the way he should arrange his hair. He anticipated it would be draining. Rather, it was stabilizing. One evening, while he lingered in Mallory's kitchen, observing Lily and Sophie as they endeavored to show him the art of braiding hair with one of their dolls, an unsettling realization dawned on him. He hoped for permanence in this situation. He had devoted his whole existence to the conviction that work held the utmost significance, viewing love and family as mere distractions, and perceiving emotions as a sign of weakness in a man. Yet, as he sat there, 2 6-year-olds giggling at his unsuccessful effort to braid synthetic blonde strands, he found it hard to recall what had ever led him to believe he could do it. Mallory rested against the counter, observing the unfolding scene with a playful smirk. "You've become completely entangled in their web." Garrett looked up, a smirk playing on his lips. "I'm not quite sure what you mean." Sophie raised her gaze. "He's surprisingly skilled at braiding." Lily gave a slight nod. "Absolutely, especially for someone just starting out." Mallory shook her head in disbelief. "They're simply showing kindness. The braid is a complete mess." Garrett let out a weary sigh as he placed the doll gently on the surface. "All right. I acknowledge my loss." Sophie beamed with delight. "With consistent effort, your skills will improve." The idea nestled within him, a comforting yet strange sensation. Once the girls settled into their slumber, Garrett lingered in the quiet of the night. Mallory offered him a cup of tea, a gesture she had consistently made during their time together, in those days when life felt more straightforward. He cradled the cup in his hands, observing her intently. "You're allowing me to enter," he remarked after a pause. Mallory let out a breath, folding her arms across her chest. "I suppose I am. What is the reason?" She paused, contemplating her response. "It's evident in the way their eyes linger on you. Your presence is appreciated by them." She cast her eyes toward the corridor that led to the twins' room. "It seems they could really benefit from your presence." Garrett swallowed, the gravity of those words settling heavily upon him. "How about you?" Mallory chuckled softly, shaking her head in amusement. "I'm still uncertain." He nodded, placing his cup on the table. "That seems reasonable." They lingered in quietude for a moment, the atmosphere surrounding them now less charged than it had been weeks prior. Mallory let out a deep sigh at last. "So, you're definitely sticking around, huh?" Garrett locked eyes with her. "Absolutely. I exist." For the first time, she chose not to confront him. For the first time in his life, he found himself not seeking an escape. Garrett had never envisioned that one fleeting instant could alter the trajectory of his existence so profoundly. For years, he held on to the conviction that mastery and exactness were the essential ingredients for achievement, viewing emotions as burdens and family as mere interruptions. Yet here he was, back in Mallory's kitchen, assisting Lily and Sophie in adorning cupcakes for their impending birthday, and it struck him just how mistaken he had been. The kitchen resonated with joy, infused with the sweet aroma of vanilla. The twins were adorned in a dusting of flour and frosting, their tiny hands creating a delightful chaos on the counter as they meticulously sprinkled vibrant colors atop the cupcakes. Garrett had attempted to assist, but after leaving a smear of blue icing on Sophie's nose and receiving a reprimand from Lily for disrupting the visual appeal, he found himself relegated to the task of cleaning up. Garrett observed Lily scrutinizing the cupcake with the intensity of a connoisseur evaluating a gourmet dish, remarking, "You're really taking this to heart." "It must be flawless," she declared, meticulously arranging the sprinkles with precision. "Today marks our special day." Sophie savored the sweet frosting as it clung to her fingers. "In my opinion, they appear satisfactory." "Fine is simply not sufficient," Lily whispered. Garrett wore a sly grin. "That reminds me of a certain individual I'm familiar with." Mallory, observing from her vantage point in the kitchen, arched an eyebrow. Curious about the source of that trait. Lily and Sophie completed their cupcakes and leaped down from their stools, pleased with their creation. "Is it possible for us to share these with Mom?" Lily inquired. Garrett gave a slight nod. "Proceed." The girls dashed away, their giggles echoing in the air. Once they disappeared from view, Mallory faced Garrett, arms crossed defiantly. Ah, the topic of birthday gifts. Garrett rested against the counter. What is the situation with them? Mallory cast him a glance. It seems like you have a delightful surprise in store for them, don't you? Garrett wore a sly grin. I'm not quite sure what you mean. Garrett. He let out a heavy breath, raising his hands in defeat. All right. I might have taken things a tad too far. Mallory let out an exasperated sigh. How excessive. Let's just say, a pony might play a role in this tale. She let out a low groan. You actually got them a pony? Garrett wore a sly grin. In a technical sense, the purchase hasn't been made yet. Mallory concealed her face behind her hands. This is hard to fathom. They truly deserve something extraordinary, he remarked, his tone now more gentle. Mallory let her hands fall and locked eyes with him. They don't require elaborate displays, Garrett. Your presence is essential. He locked eyes with her, an unvoiced connection lingering in the air. Following a lengthy silence, he gave a nod. I understand. Mallory let out a weary sigh, choosing silence over confrontation. Instead, she cast her gaze toward the hallway where the girls had vanished. It's clear they truly appreciate your presence, don't you think? Garrett gulped. I truly enjoy my time here. Mallory paused briefly, then offered him a faint smile. Then remain. Garrett paused before responding. He was not obligated to. For deep down, he was already aware. He was staying put. Not at this moment. Never. This narrative transcends the mere account of a billionaire uncovering the existence of his offspring. It revolves around accountability, atonement, and the understanding that genuine achievement is not quantified by riches but by the connections we foster. Garrett begins as an individual who is convinced he has mastery over every aspect of his life, his career, his emotions, his future. However, the entrance of Lily and Sophie disrupts all his previous assumptions. Initially, he grapples with uncertainty, trying to find his place within their realm. As the narrative progresses, he comes to understand that fatherhood transcends grand gestures or monetary stability, it lies in the simple act of being present. Lily and Sophie, though still young, actively contribute to his transformation rather than remaining mere bystanders. They are the ones who encourage his growth, who insist on authenticity and engagement. Their purity and inquisitiveness compel Garrett to face the decisions he's taken and the existence he's been evading. Mallory also plays an essential role in his journey. She represents not only the mother of his children but also a reflection of his past self and a challenge for his future potential. Her hesitation to allow him back into their lives stems not from bitterness, but from a desire to safeguard the daughters she nurtured on her own. The allure of the conclusion lies not in flawlessness but in the journey of advancement. Garrett doesn't transform into the ideal father in an instant, nor does Mallory place her trust in him right away. What truly enhances the impact of the ending is his decision to remain. He consistently makes the effort to be present, day in and day out, demonstrating not only to Mallory and the girls but also to himself, that he desires to belong to this family. The climactic moment, when he understands that he is not merely a transient figure in their lives but rather someone who truly belongs, is what imbues the narrative with profound significance. Ultimately, Garrett Hale acquires not only daughters but also a newfound purpose that transcends his empire.